Behold! The sword of power. Excalibur.
Welcome to episode 4 of the Oh Gosh, Oh Golly, Oh Wow podcast, the podcast where we talk about the Marvel Comics series Excalibur and nothing but Excalibur every week for 126 weeks. This week in episode 4, we are looking at Excalibur number 4, still crazy after all these years, originally published in January 1989. Creative team is Chris Claremont on writing, Alan Davis on penciling and plotting, Paul Neary on inks, Glynis Oliver on coloring, Tom Orzechowski on lettering, and Terry Cavanaugh on editing.
Your wisdom has forged this ring. Hereafter, so that we remember our bonds, we shall always come together in a circle to hear and tell of deeds good and brave. I will build a round table where this fellowship shall meet, and a hall about the table, and a castle about the hall, and I will marry, and the land will have an heir to wield Excalibur. Knights of the Round Table.
This is one of my favorite issues of the entire series, largely because of a particular scene with Kurt and Megan, which I look forward to making us all discuss in depth. So I'm excited about that. And I am also excited about our guest today, who I will introduce in a moment. But first, we'll introduce the usual team, starting with myself. I am Dr. Anna Papard. In addition to being Kurt Wagner's unofficial PR manager, I write and talk about representations of gender and sexuality in comics and pop culture. I'm the editor of the recent anthology Super Sex, Sexuality, Fantasy, and the Superhero. And I am still in shock that I host a podcast about my favorite comic book series. I am joined, as always, by Mav, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Christopher Maverick. You can call me Mav. I am a PhD student, all but dissertation. I am an adjunct professor at Duquesne University and Mount Aloysius College, two different places. I'm the host of the Vox Popcast, Popular Culture Podcast, and I am a longtime avid comic book reader. Most of my research is on representations of gender, sexuality, race, and class, and in 20th century pop culture. So comics are right up my alley. And as you've heard on the previous episodes of this podcast, Excalibur is one of my longtime favorites.
He's been reading it since issue 1.
Yes, since issue 0.
Yes, of course. And Andrew, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm Dr. Andrew DeMann. I'm a lecturer at St. Jerome's University, and I am the project lead for the Claremont Run, which is a complicated beast, but a big study on Chris Claremont's writing with a big social media micro publishing focus. And I'm also published in other stuff, so you can look me up.
You're published in many, many places, and we'll have some links to, as usual, sort of links to some of our relevant publications in our write-ups on the show. And how many followers do you have on Claremont Run these days? You're like over 6,000, right?
Yeah, I think we're just over 6,000 now.
Man, see, like for an academic account, like doing deep dives into old comics, I think that's pretty darn good. But
I assume it's just Russian bots.
Yeah, every time, like, I have significantly fewer followers, and every time I drop a follower, I like, oh, maybe it was just a bot. And I was like, no, I probably posted too much stuff about Nightcrawler. But anyway, as I mentioned, we have a very exciting guest on the pod this week. We are joined by Sydney Heifler, who is a comic book historian who specializes in romance comics. She's a graduate of Oxford, yes, that Oxford, and is currently pursuing a PhD in history at The Ohio State University. Her work's been featured in Panel by Panel and Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics. We first met a couple years ago, I think, at the Michigan U Comics Forum. So I wanted to come have you on the pod because of your romance comics work, because we've been talking a lot about genre bending in this particular series, and I thought you'd be a wonderful person to speak to that a little bit. But I'm curious, because we haven't really talked about it much, but was this your first time encountering Excalibur? Are you going in cold? This is your first issue of the series?
I'm going cold, and I'm really excited about that. And so I purposely did not read anything else except for the issue that you sent me, because I wanted this to be like a brand new experience. And I honestly had no idea what Excalibur was about before. The first time I saw Excalibur, I was like, is that like King Arthur or something? Like, I had no idea. And I saw superheroes, and I was like, that doesn't make any sense. And so, yes, this is my first time.
Like, do you have any sort of prior familiarity with kind of X-Men stuff, or are you sort of like really going in cold?
Like, well, no, so I watched all the X-Men movies, obviously. Even before I got into comic book research, I had a huge crush on Hugh Jackman, and then I watched all the who doesn't have a huge crush on Hugh Jackman?
It sounds reasonable to me.
Yeah, and so yeah, I follow it, and I always thought X-Men were really fun. And I collected some X-Men toys, because who doesn't, and stuff like that. And I've read a few X-Men comics and some other Marvel comics, but no, I haven't really ever really dived into X-Men in comics in any sort of serious way. So in that way, it was also still relatively new for me. Also, I should mention, I used to watch like the X-Men cartoons growing up a lot, but I was really confused because I used to think all cartoons were part of like one cartoon universe, so I didn't really conceptualize them as the X-Men. So yes, in a lot of ways, this is all brand new to me.
Oh my god, I love that. I love that massive cartoon universe.
I'm not. I can't say she's wrong. I mean,
no,
it all makes sense to me.
Yeah, exactly. They're all friends.
No, that like in the cartoon All Stars.
I was gonna say
cartoon.
Every once in a while, all cartoons get together and they try to convince you to not do drugs. It's
that was my impression. Well, I want to talk a little bit more about first impressions, but I think we'll do sort of our intro to the issue, our little summary first, and then we'll get back to some of those first impressions, because I am so excited to have a total newbie on the pod to be like, what the hell did you make of this thing? So as I mentioned, I'm hoping that we'll get people reading along with the pod, but if you haven't read this issue in a while, maybe not since Reagan was president. He would have just been switching over anyway.
He was still president. He was being term limited at this.
Yes,
yeah, and he's never really left our consciousness, so you're not quite incorrect.
True. Well, technically the final days of his official presidency. But if you haven't read the issue since then, you might want a little bit of a summary of what happens. So we will do that first. So Excalibur #4 is still crazy after all these years. Opens in a romantic vein with Courtney Ross, the ex-flame of Captain Britain, aka Brian Braddock, gazing nostalgically at a photograph of herself in a passionate embrace with Brian in his original Captain Britain uniform when she was still a quote-unquote young, and used a month's worth of wages to buy up all the tickets at a Kisses for Cancer fundraiser. Kind of stalkery, but also you follow your passion. Courtney packs up to head home after a long day at the office, being the Ice Queen manager of Fraser's Bank, when she's attacked by the Crazy Gang. The Crazy Gang is an Alice in Wonderland themed group of supervillains with a complicated backstory. They were created back in Alan Moore's run on Captain Britain by a guy known as Jim Jaspers in a reality warping event. It's a whole thing, but we'll talk about that a little bit. The short story is the Crazy Gang are neither human nor sane, which makes them difficult to deal with. Courtney proves her resourcefulness by fighting off the Crazy Gang, but ends up jumping into a cab driven by none other than the gang's current boss, frequent Spider-Man and X-Men foe Arcade of Murderworld fame. The next day, Shadowcat, aka Kitty Pryde, and Phoenix, aka Rachel Summers, are seen at a department store that isn't quite Marks and Spencer, shopping. Rachel is supposed to be picking up some more conservative attire so as not to attract quite so much attention when the team is out and about in civilian spaces. She hates it. So she makes Kitty dress more like her, i.e. 80s sexy. Hello, big hair, crystal-studded shoulder pads, and enormous statement jewelry. Kitty says she hates it, but actually sort of likes it, maybe? But twist, the money that they get out of the Fraser's Bank machine is fake. It's images of the Crazy Gang on it rather than the good old Queen. Back at the lighthouse, Megan, wearing a teensy tiny bikini, checks in on Nightcrawler, aka Kurt Vonnegut, Wagner as he's constructing a jungle gym in the basement. They flirt, or at least Kurt does in his own unique manner, literally sweeping Megan off her feet, tossing her into the air, and then tickling her until they crash to the ground in a messy pile. Megan leans over Kurt to ask if he's okay. He says it was worth it to bring this sparkle to her eyes. Megan, an empathic metamorph, transforms into a female version of Kurt as they almost so nearly kiss. At the last moment, they're interrupted by Brian's voice from another room. Megan flies off frantically, ashamed, while Kurt similarly berates himself. The team uses the messages on the fake money to determine Courtney Ross has been kidnapped by Arcade and the Crazy Gang. Brian flies into a rage and attempts to go after them. Rachel stops him. The team will go after Courtney together. Elsewhere, Arcade has dressed up Courtney Ross as a Playboy bunny and ordered her to make jokes in front of a hissing horde of toothy monsters to avoid getting stomped on by a giant mechanical foot. Luckily for Courtney, she's funny as she manages to stave off getting squished. Still elsewhere, geneticist Moira McTaggart and her bodyguard Callisto are seen riding a train and discussing undisclosed irregularities in Rachel's medical workup. Before Moira can explain, that robot that we have been running into frequently, who is still not officially named Widget, turns a train bridge into a dimensional portal and Moira and Callisto vanish. Finally, Excalibur arrives at Arcade's base of operations and confronts the Crazy Gang. Brian, true to form, goes off half-cocked, which allows the gang to use a mind-swapping device on the team. Brian gets switched with Tweedledope, Kurt gets switched with Jester, Megan gets switched with the mechanical knave, and Rachel becomes the executioner. Rachel's situation is complicated, which we will get back to. The issue ends with the mind-swapped Excalibur taken prisoner, all except Kitty and Lockheed. Okay, so this was another issue in which a heck of a lot happened. So maybe let's start with some first impressions, and maybe let's start with you, Sydney, since you're reading this for the first time. Andrew and Mav read this when they were like 14, 15. I read this for the first time about 12 years ago, but you're coming in fresh. What was your first impression? Did this make any sense to you? Highlights?
Yeah, so I actually did make, because we open up with some romantic themes, some tropes, and I was like, I know what this is about. This is all I read in romance comics. Especially the whole buying all of the kisses. That's very much something you would see in a romance comic. I was here for it. I was like, yes, I would do the same, most likely. Yeah. And then,
so when Anna said it was stalkerish, it was
stalkerish. Yeah. Not proud. No, just kidding. But so that was really cool. I really enjoyed that. And then there was the 80s themes that were coming across really strongly, and I've done some work on 80s stuff, so I recognized that. And then there's just a lot of good things in this comic. It was hectic, but I loved it. Also, when we got to that Nightcrawler scene, I mentioned this to you already, Anna, but I was like, I did not know that Nightcrawler was fine as hell. Like, I feel like I've been cheated. Where was that Nightcrawler in the X-Men movies? Like, forget Captain Britain. Like, give me Nightcrawler all the way. And I love the visual rhetoric that was employed from Playboy and other sort of more masculine comics. Or this is a masculine comic, but more like that kind of traditional pinup vernacular that's been used in a lot of publications that were aimed at men in the earlier post-war era. And so I was very excited to see that. I think this was like very well artistically done in that. I think it was very clever. So I loved it. I want to read all the comics now. You've converted me.
Wow. Well, I mean, that's definitely one of the goals of the pod. I mean, as Kurt Wagner's unofficial PR manager, a huge goal of the pod is to let everybody know about the good version of Nightcrawler. So we are already succeeding in that.
Yeah, we've done it. We're like, why bother to do all the rest of the episode?
No, I want more. I want more recognition. But I'm glad you found it like sort of followable to an extent. Well, what about you, Andrew and Mav? Like, Andrew, I know this was your first issue of Excalibur that you actually read, was it not?
It was, yeah. It was confusing, I think, the first time I read it. And I think I developed that really important Excalibur literacy skill of just like letting things go. Like, this is not going to make sense. I should just read the next scene kind of thing. And I do remember being deeply affected by the Excalibur, or sorry, the Kurt and Megan scene, exactly as I'm sure we're going to talk about.
Yes, we are definitely going to talk about it.
Yeah, so it was one of those things that kind of, I don't know, there's that famous poem, I give you the end of a golden thread, and the poem is the golden thread, the idea being that it's going to be confusing as hell, but it makes you want to unravel it. And I feel like Excalibur issue 4 kind of does that. Like, I wouldn't call it well structured or well composed in terms of like your usual narrative structure and ideas of resolution, but it made me want to read a lot more Excalibur, which is, great.
Oh, that's so, yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, I have such a hard time deciding whether I could say a comic book like this is well composed, because it depends what you're getting out of it, right? I mean, we talked
Yeah.
way back in our first episode about Excalibur is sort of teaching you a way to read it as it's sort of developing what it does, right? And so the breakneck pace of this, I feel like by issue 4, like starting at issue 1, I'm just like, yeah, this is Excalibur. Like I kind of know what this is now. But it's interesting, yeah, like encountering this for the first time and like what we make of it. How about you, Mav? First impressions?
Yeah. Okay. So as I've said on all of our previous episodes, I was reading this real time as it's coming out. I was 14. I was a 14-year-old comic book reader. I was exactly the age that is being targeted here. There's a lot of we'll talk about in a little bit male gazy moments in this particular comic, which were obviously drawn directly for me. So I get what's going on. What's interesting about it is I'm coming at this from a place where I've been for 7 to 10 years now at this point reading X-Men comics. This is just before I started working in a comic book store. So I had certainly comic book literacy, but this is very much not the formula for a 1988 comic. It's a January 1989 issue. You said the end of the Reagan presidency. This would have come out. He would have officially left office in January. So 2 months early for a publication date. This would have come out probably in November. So I've been reading comics for a while, and this is not the standard X-Men formula. Your standard X-Men comic opens up in the middle of a fight. Everybody yells their name. We and their powers, and then we sort of progress from there. This is a 24-page story. The fight starts on page 19. Like this is very much not the mode of how an 80s comic is constructed. It's less weird probably reading it in 2021, but at that time, it's very odd, and I think I want the readers to appreciate our listeners to appreciate how odd that is given the context of when it actually came out. It is entirely a story. This is Sydney's first issue, but this is a story that, even though it is sort of jumping into the middle of these people's lives, like Courtney is looking at a picture of herself from years ago with no reference to why her hair is a different color. We did that a couple issues ago, and we're not doing it. So it's dropping you in the middle of the story, but it is very much sort of about establishing relationships. Even though Courtney's alone, we start with establishing Courtney's relationship with Brian. Then we move to establishing Kitty and Rachel's relationship with each other. Then Kurt and Megan's relationship with each other. And then Brian's relationship with the team. And we sort of roll through how everybody is affecting one another until we finally get to the story actually starting on page 14 when you see Arcade talking to Court. There's a lot of relationship building here.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit in our last episode about sort of some of the domestic qualities of Excalibur, right? And I think we see that here as well, although I thought we saw it even more so in the last issue, the moving day issue.
Yeah.
But let's start talking about romance then and bring Sydney a bit more into the conversation here. I'm curious, you're saying, Mav, that this is very unusual to have kind of, in a lot of senses, that this issue, despite having a lot of action and a lot of particularly zany action, it is framed by romance, and relationships are really central to this comic. And we're sort of identifying this for us as, primarily superhero readers, although we read all kinds of things, but we're very versed in the superhero genre. We're identifying this as being unusual for the superhero genre in this time in particular. And yet, superhero comics and romance comics have a long intertwined history.
Absolutely.
Is that something that you're able to speak to at all, Sydney? Like some of those interconnections between superheroes and romance comics? And we know that Simon and Kirby created Captain America, and they also created the romance genre.
Yes, yeah, of course they created the romance drama. That everyone knows that story. Simon saw someone reading a confession magazine, remembered that his wife liked confession magazines, and then was like, "Hey, let's do this in comic book format," and it took off. That whole the myth, the legend.
Yes.
But yes, I can definitely speak. I mean, Kirby purposely brought a lot of romantic themes to superhero comics when he got into those in a big way. After the whole romance comic situation. So yeah, that definitely happened. But in terms of this specific issue, yes, there's a lot of relationships between this issue and romance comics. And I was thinking about it because in a lot of ways you wouldn't think it when you first look at this comic. The panels are not constructed in a way at all that mirrors the 1950s romance comics that I read a lot of. The fashion.
Yeah. Tell us about that. In what sense are the panels different to you?
They're so much more like rectangular instead of square. Not that rectangles don't exist in romance comics, but I just feel like this is much more gridded and also longer panels. Like the panels are just taller, and that is just very different. And there's a lot more change between like close up and far away between of the characters, and so you just don't see that. Also, you get a lot of like women alone in panels where they're not crying about man, and so there's and there's women talking to each other, and it's not about a man, it's about Chloe, and so you have like in a lot of ways this is very different. But like you start off, like I said, with that kissing booth thing, and that's such a that you would see that in a romance comic. That would be like a really fun little story. But what is different is that in romance comics it tends to only be one story. It's not like a character that you get invested in. It doesn't appear constantly. There's no fandom surrounding a certain character, so that's very different. And then but another similarity is that we get to that whole the whole interesting love triangle situation. First of all, love triangles always in a romance comic, usually between two guys and a girl. It's a commonly used thing, usually to help a girl realize that she likes the wrong type of men and she should like good boys. But in here it's a little bit different. I don't quite think either of them are bad boys, although Nightcrawler, he's giving off some bad boy vibes, I must say. But what is interesting is that when you see is her, I can't remember the character's name, Megan, when you see Megan
Yes.
freaking out about Captain Britain over the other character, she's only freaking out about it in sort of this thought balloon, and that is very much a romance comic thing. If a lady in a romance comic is freaking out about a man liking someone else, it's always in a thought balloon. These women do not get to speak about it, and so you see these women constricted. So you also see that, and if you also notice, that character is not in the same sort of visual rhetoric as the other characters. She's drawn much more like a Playboy sort of character, softer, more curvy, and so it's like I don't know if that was on purpose. I imagine it was. It kind of places her in a different sort of genre. She's almost kind of like in a romance comic form, but not quite, because they weren't drawn in bathing suits usually. Well, they were, but not like that as a consistent thing, and they were a little bit different stylistically. But you can see how she's kind of different. So there is definitely a lot of romance comic-y things about this thing, but it's also very different. But yeah, so I hope that answers your question. I was looking for it. But yeah, and also, yeah, but the character, she's silenced just like in a romance comic, in the thought bubble. I thought that was fascinating. I love that.
That is really fascinating. Yeah, I mean, again, we've talked a lot about sort of genre bending and blending when we've been talking in our previous episodes. And it's, I've been thinking about different ways that works, right? And partly, as you're saying this, I'm just like, I almost want to be like, are certain characters in the title operating within different genres? And is the genre mixing coming out in the interactions with the characters? Like, is Kurt sort of operating in one genre, Megan's operating in another genre, Brian's operating in another genre? And like, we sort of sometimes see genre mixing in that way, perhaps. And that's like a really interesting possibility.
And then another thing about the genre bending, we have Courtney, right? And I want if I could take a moment to address a particular issue with Courtney. Is that okay?
Definitely.
Okay. So I just love when she's put in the Playboy Bunny outfit. Can we talk about that? Like, that is totally, they're drawing of this visual rhetoric that's very much like we're kind of the good girl art, right? And but they play with it. They put her in that, but they play with it in a really cool way. And what's interesting is that instead of constantly being subjected to the male gaze, which she obviously is, she takes this moment to kind of take this sort of feminine mask that it's an idea that's been put forth by Evans and Thornton in their research on fashion, but she takes this sort of feminine masks and uses it to distance herself from the people, or the monsters, I should say, that are watching her, and take control of that moment. Because it's funny when they say, oh, she's successful at being funny in that one scene where then the monsters, and then she's not killed by the giant shoe, but she's using her body in a way that's very feminine in that moment. So she kind of takes control. So that I feel like is more, they're kind of beating readers' expectations. They're pulling in the sort of older good girl art style, but then playing a trick on readers, like, oh, but she's actually taking control of that moment. So that's another issue of genre sort of bending, like taking it in and then twisting it in an unexpected way.
Yeah, and I love that, because that speaks to what can be really empowering about genre bending, both on sort of a representational level, but I mean also sort of for a reader participation thing too, right? To get us introduced in this romance mode, and then we see a number of sort of problematic romance tropes introduced throughout the issue as well. But to have Courtney chained to a very kind of different type of character, or at least kind of use those tropes tropes, you know, in a sort of I don't want to quite say empowering way, but certainly to be manipulating some of those tropes by the end of the comic. That's such a fascinating journey for her from sort of the beginning of this comic to the end of this comic. And I mean, there's so much that I feel like we could say about sort of her fashion, like as that happens to, you know, that outfit that she's wearing at Fraser's Bank, which is very buttoned up with the sort of military details. Like it's this flowing dress with sort of the military details up top. And that's sort of such an interesting choice for some of the dualities of that character.
Yeah, I would like to talk about Courtney a little more for exactly those reasons. So, just a little background of when I was reading this in 1988. This is the issue that I fall in love with Courtney Ross. And it's we'll discuss on episode 5. We'll discuss this further because this will matter in the future. But in Courtney's first few appearances in this series, and remember, I had not read any Captain Britain before this. I had very little understanding of the character. She was just she filled a role. It's like, oh, okay, she's going to be the other woman in Brian's life. Got it. And do I need to care about her beyond the fact that like she's just there to cause trouble in Brian and Megan's relationship? And that's how I thought about her until this issue. And then I never really analyzed how I felt about this until now, because I was 14 and not like, you know, PhD Mav. This is child Mav. So I didn't really think about it other than, oh, she's actually cool. But what's going on here? We've got, not only does she have her militaristic outfit that you were just talking about, she announces through her thought balloons the very manner in which she has constructed her identity. She calls herself the Ice Queen. She knows what she's doing. She knows what she's doing when she's attacked by the crazy gang right after that. She understands genre tropes. Like, she understands who they are. She understands what's going on. She is aware of and not afraid of them or Arcade. You know, she references him by name when he kidnaps her. And when she gets put into the Playboy costume, she knows what she's doing. She knows what this means, and she knows to play into it. She makes a dedicated choice, you know, not on accident to, you know, I'm going to tell jokes, but I'm going to tell jokes while standing backwards and sticking my butt in the face of these monsters while arching my back so that I can look sexy. I am playing to the gaze because I know I can manipulate the creatures here, which is odd because they're not human, but it works.
That's like an Excalibur logic thing that you just have to follow.
Right. And you just roll with it. But like everything about her here is, I am not a superhero. I am a regular person, but I understand the rules of the situation that I'm in, and I'm going to work within them in order to sort of get what I want, where what I want here is to survive to the end of the day. There is so much understanding that happens in this issue, more so than what I saw last episode with her or in the previous ones. It makes her not only a real person, but a complex and powerful person. And it's a play of both her intelligence and her sexuality combining, which I think is just fascinating.
And that connects really well to Sydney's point too, about the idea of the mask, because we could discuss this in terms of like Riviere's Feminine Masquerade. The idea that Courtney is self-conscious in her portrayal of, you know, whatever, but in this case, femininity particularly. And, you know, she's using that very pragmatically to get out of a difficult and dangerous situation.
It's so Claremont too, isn't it, Andrew? Like, I mean, it really reminds me of, again, because Arcade is involved too, but, you know, Uncanny 204, the Whatever Happened to Nightcrawler issue, which I've written about for Claremont Run before, you know, Judith Radziwill sorry, that is not her correct name, but it's Judith, that's the princess. In that issue, and she's very similar to sort of the way Courtney behaves here, where she's thrown into an alarming situation involving Murderworld and is so capable. I mean, she's like fighting off robotic dogs and can really like take care of herself, right?
Yeah, for sure.
I think this is part of why, as one that's completely outside of Excalibur, that's never read an Excalibur issue, that I was able to follow it, because Claremont has constructed a very like realistic woman, I think, especially one that's coming out of the 80s, in which women are kind of combining this feminist notion of the previous decade with also the idea of the empowered work woman that wasn't quite in the feminist narrative, and sort of like merging this kind of these concepts together through this arc, and it just makes perfect sense with that outfit that Anna mentioned. That was very like part of that narrative. It just made sense historically. It made sense for the time period. She's super convincing, and I just loved it.
Yeah, I'm so interested that like that you found it very sort of understandable, sort of coming from a romance comics background, but also coming from having some of this cultural background, sort sort of that the superhero aspects of it weren't jarring for you because it sort of had a genre or elements of a genre that you recognized, which again, I think is part of, I do think about this as kind of like an accessible series in a lot of ways through the genre mixing, which can be a challenge as well. And yet it hits so many different notes, right? Because it has action and romance, because it has humor, because it has pathos and drama and tragedy. There's so many different entry points for this series. And I find that one of the most interesting things about it.
I just had a question for all of you, because I was kind of, there was a moment that I wasn't quite sure if it was normal for these comics or normal for comics in the 80s or normal. I was like, this seems interesting. I have no idea. Where it seems like Courtney has a moment where she's very aware that she's in a comic, where she says, "Oh yeah, I can't say that because you can't put it in print or something." And I'm like, does she know that her words are appearing in print? And I was like very thrown off.
So as far as normal goes, I don't recall it being a normal thing as in a common thing. I don't believe, given anything else in the series, that Courtney is aware that she's in a comic book per se. She is smarter than your average damsel in distress. But so a year later, John Byrne, who has a history with Claremont, starts a series called Sensational She-Hulk, and he starts it in 1989. Another of my favorite books for that time. And She-Hulk in that book is very aware that she's in a comic book. She can bend reality because of her awareness. It is an entirely metafictional book that plays with the narrative. And there are other experimental titles that are going on at the
Howard
time.
the Duck would be a good example.
Yeah, which is earlier. That starts in the late 70s, I want to say. I don't remember the exact year on Howard. So there are other things that are doing it, but not, I don't know that Courtney is aware enough to the level that they're doing it, but probably more so than other people. So I think this is more Claremont playing with the narrative than the character.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of thinking about to what degree sort of some of the genre bending is or isn't revolutionary here too, like what do we think about the place of this sort of in the history of Marvel being inherently sort of genre bending? Because that maybe gets us to that question as well. Because I mean, that kind of self-reflexivity is very trademark of Marvel. I mean, you know, like we've been having the Thing sort of look at the reader and talk to us for like a long time by this point, right? So
Stanley and Jack Kirby appear at Reed and Sue's wedding in like 1965.
Well, and yeah, as early
like
as what is their first cameo in like Fantastic Four #10? So I mean,
something like that.
Yeah, and Dr. Doom's hunting them.
Yeah, so it does happen from time to time. It is kind of a wink and a nod at the reader, and I feel like Arcade's crazy enough to where like these things can be read two ways. It's sort of it's not so much magical the way say She-Hulk or Howard the Duck are, or Deadpool for if a reader who doesn't know those older comics, somebody who's like listening to our show and thinking about things they might read today. Deadpool does this all the time in both the comics and in his films. So I don't know that it's on that level, but I think it is sort of it's being very clever so that the reader goes, see what we did there, see what we did, you know.
I mean, maybe the interesting thing about it is that moment is given to Courtney, which sort of speaks to some of the things with her agency that we've been talking about, right?
Excellent.
And it corresponds with the cover, of course, as well.
Yeah, the cover is very metafictional.
I want to talk about the cover, but I'm saving it for the end.
Okay.
Because I do want to talk about the cover because it is one of the most iconic Excalibur covers. But let's talk about the Kurt and Megan scene, because like we're talking about romance, we're talking about agency, we're talking about consent. All of those things are a major issue in that particular scene. So I will say first that this is one of my favorite Kurt scenes of all time, and yet it's weird revisiting it. So again, I read it for the first time maybe about 12 years ago. A lot of the consent stuff I didn't spend much time thinking about the first time. I just really didn't. I sort of, my takeaway was just like, man, this is a great Kurt scene. Like his personality is coming across here so well. I love so many of the ways that he's kind of like making himself accessible and things in this scene. It's just so fascinating. And yet Megan's involvement in this scene is something that we can definitely talk about and definitely question. And yeah, maybe let's kind of start from there. Did you guys sort of have also sort of those issues with seeing some of the consent issues going on in that scene, and what are the issues? What are the issues? Either. It could be either.
I definitely didn't then.
Yeah.
The
Yeah,
world's very
saw that.
different in 2021 than it was in 1988.
But I mean, I'm saying like even 12 years ago, it's different for me. I mean, like I was a feminist, I was an academic like 12 years ago, but my takeaway was just like, man, that was a hot Nightcrawler scene, and I didn't think about it that much, right?
I mean, I think there's a lot of like self-validation in it that I find kind of creepy. Like he makes a point of having Megan be all like, haha, don't stop, haha, even after saying stop.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that just by kind of apologizing for it with that, I feel like that actually makes it a lot creepier to me.
Oh, yeah.
I agree with that point. It was like, and are we talking about like the one where he starts tickling her? Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
This is
Oh my gosh.
We'll note for you too, Sydney, that this is a common move of Kurt's. He had done this to other people several times in Uncanny X-Men prior to this. So this is a go-to move for him, which is definitely not one of the most charming things about it.
I actually had like a moment like where I was not reading this as a person who knows anything about comics, even romance comics. I was just like, tickling to get close is the worst move in the world.
It's not good. It's not good.
I hate him in this moment, and it reminded me of all the men who have ever tickled me in a move, and I was like, ah. And so that was a very problematic moment. I will say, in terms of like what's in a comic, I have seen a lot worse, and there is a lot worse in romance comics. But yeah, it was. But at the same time, like I can understand why 12 years ago when you first read this, you were like, oh wow, this is an amazing scene for Kurt, and you know, and everything. But yeah, no, the whole issue there, the consent isn't there, and it kind of I guess this is what bugs me about it. It kind of besides the tickling, it kind of plays on this whole idea of like, oh, a girl can kind of put up and say no, but it doesn't, or like suggest no, but it doesn't really mean no.
I mean, like, I do think, okay, so, like, this isn't a defense of it at all, but I mean, one of the things that I find particularly interesting about the scene is the way I do think it's conscious of those issues, in the sense that we get a lot of, so in the panel where he first swoops her up and she says, are you mad? Her dialogue box is saying one thing, her face is clearly thrilled, right?
Yeah.
And we get, like, a lot of that back and forth, like, even, you know, in the scene where he is tickling her and she's shouting no, and yet her face is delighted, right? So it is definitely that trope of, like, she's saying no but really means yes, but we do have the complexity of that sort of playing out in the sort of like relationship between the text and the images, and that's not a defense of it at all, more just that like I do think there's an awareness of the complexity of it, and I'm not landing one way or the other on it. I think the tickling is problematic no matter what we do.
That's another issue. Oh, sorry.
No, please go.
I was gonna say that's another thing is I was wondering, it's like they weren't necessarily saying it wasn't problematic as they presented it. Like it's very much presented as here's a weird scene between two people that has some very complex problematic things going on. So I don't think it's not like in a romance comic where people used to put things in and be like, it's okay, that's just how it is. Like, you know, I don't think the creators of this comic necessarily were thinking like, oh, this is just how it is. Like I feel like they're acknowledging that it's not how it is and it's a problem between the two characters.
And see, that's where I'm wondering, right? Because I'm gonna go both ways here. And that's because I have background for not only this entire series, but I don't, Sydney, I guess you've watched X-Men movies, but you haven't read the entire, 200 issue lead up to
Definitely
this in X-Men. so, like Anna's right. This is Kurt's go-to move, right? And I think that in some sense, Claremont writing this in the 80s, he's aware of it being a little creepy, but I don't think he's being as judgmental of it in 1988 as we might see the judgment in 2021. I think that, that problematic nature of tickling is like, it's seen at this point as, and then I think you'll probably say this from the romance comics, it's one of those weird consent loopholes. Well, I'm not raping, I'm just tickling. It's different, right? It's not.
Or
I understand.
Even I'm not sexy touching, I'm playful touching.
I'm
because
playful
I'm
touching.
a controller and I'm so cute and
Anna.
I'm a boy and blah 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 blah.
Right.
I love that. Just really quick, Anna, I love that. I love it because that's something that men do. It's like, I'm not sexy touching you, I'm funny touching you. It's fine.
Yeah, it's a complete bullshit argument, right? Yeah. But I think that's the mentality that Kurt, the character, probably thinks of in this moment. Like it's excusing it there. And what makes it work for me is not, we'll get to the tickling in a second, I'll get back to that, but Kurt does this move when he's playing around in danger rooms where he's like, oh look, I'm going to save you, and he throws her, and the context is he's surprised when she doesn't fall. He jumps over there to go catch her. He's done this to people he was romantically interested in, or just other people. This is a total thing that he would have done to Kitty a million times in X-Men comics, right? and he's not romantically interested in her at all. It's just the playfulness of how Kurt is, and I'm not excusing it. It's what he does, and Kitty wouldn't have had a problem with it if this were Amanda Sefton, his longtime girlfriend / sister. She wouldn't have had a problem with it. It's weird. Sydney's like, what?
Yeah, we can't go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, we're not gonna. But yeah,
he has a long-time relationship with someone who is technically his foster sister, and it's a real problem.
yeah, but like he does,
Fair.
yeah, and he does stuff like this, and it would have been just the cuteness of how Kurt behaves. I think what's supposed to make Megan strong here is that she doesn't fall. Hey, idiot, I can fly, so you can throw me. It doesn't matter. So that's supposed to make her tougher, and it's supposed to. That's where the deconstruction of like expectations to his like performative masculinity is supposed to happen. What irritates me about it and makes me not able to excuse this at all, because I feel like I can excuse that he probably has blanket permission. He almost certainly has blanket permission to tickle Amanda, and probably he could get away with it with Kitty. In his world, he's known Megan for 2 weeks here.
Oh.
They don't have that relationship yet. Like there's just, I cannot excuse it the way that I can somebody like you. If you're dating a person, if he's dating Amanda, he knows whether she's uncomfortable with tickling or not. If she is, then he shouldn't do it. If she's not, and he knows she's protesting in jest, then I'm more fine with it. Like, you can have a playful relationship with someone but he met her 2 weeks ago, and she's a girl he has a crush on, and he knows her boyfriend.
Yeah.
He knows she's involved. It's weird and problematic in every possible way. And I think we excuse it because we want to fall in love with the idea of Megan and Nightcrawler that I
Yes.
don't think is really earned. It's
Yeah.
just like,
No, I
yeah.
definitely felt that pull where I was like, I want, because one thing, he looks very physically attractive. I know he's like a blue beast, but
Mhm.
like he's a very attractive cartoon or comic character. And like, I really want to like him. And two, like it just seems so much more exciting than Captain Britain, who you see, and like, well, he just looks like he came from an office, like a boring office job. He's a shirt. Like, I don't want any of that. Like, no, thank you. Even like when he fights, he's just standing still. Like,
so Sydney, you're right. But what's awesome about this is Sydney has read exactly one Excalibur comic, just this one, and she has completely understood the entire dynamic of the Megan, Kurt, Brian relationship and how every Excalibur fan reads. She's seen these people for 24 pages. So yes, you are correct.
Also, I think like talking about why this comic resonates, because like as a woman in modern times, like these themes are super familiar to me, and so I think that's another reason. Like, that just shows the brilliance of these comics, is that I think even though we're in a weird world where like monsters can eat you if you don't tell funny jokes, like a lot of these themes are very familiar, and that shopping scene was very, very familiar. This problematic dynamic is familiar. It's all very familiar and still has a very real human quality to it.
Yeah, and I mean, I love that, by the way, just like the integration of sort of because I think I've talked before, even just with Alan Davis's art, his skill at sort of doing realistic human emotions and domestic spaces, along with his skill at doing fantasy, is just such a perfect style for sort of the genre blending that we're talking about here. But I'm Kurt's PR manager, so I gotta like defend him like a tiny bit, just not in terms of his actions, but just in terms of the way this scene kind of tries to make us like him. And I mean, there is a thing where he generates sympathy because he is this persecuted outsider character, and you like want things for him, like you want him to be accepted, you want him to get the girl, and that's part of what is potentially toxic about the way this is playing out. But it's definitely part of sort of something that you can read into his character motivation too, in terms of this character being obsessed with being liked and obsessed with being sort of thought of as cute and non-threatening as well. I think is sort of a factor in how he approaches Megan here. And in terms of that final page of this encounter, the pose that he strikes when he falls beneath her and she's leaning on top of him, and he is being his most charming there, where she's like, you're a beast. Not really. I'm much like more charming and cuter. And he's making like this little smile expression with like, her being again sort of in that sort of physical position of power in that particular pose. That's like Kurt at his most appealing, and it is manipulative. And I think that is present, and yet it's very effective.
But did it remind anyone else of the movie St. Elmo's Fire, where like I feel like it plays that kind of character? Like, I'm so charming, even though I say a lot of really horrible things. Like, do some really questionable. It's a very
we should also point
What? Sorry, you go.
We should just point out the meta joke there. When he says no, not really, I'm much more charming and cuter. He's specifically talking about
Yeah.
another friend of his.
Even
The
though I
joke is,
got that. Even
Burn
I
on
got
Hank
that.
McCoy. Yeah.
Yeah. I even
Yeah.
got that. I was like,
Okay.
"Ooh, I know that joke." Like,
Yeah.
I was very proud of myself. I'm just gonna. It was embarrassing how proud of myself I was for getting that joke.
Well, I want to bring you into this a little bit, Andrew, because I know you've got sort of some real thoughts about sort of the Megan and Brian relationship. What do you make of Megan's agency here? I will say first just that, like, how I would like to read their near kiss is that she has agency in that perhaps her powers affect him even as his, like, sort of desire affects her. That's how I want to read it. I don't think that that's made clear necessarily, but what's your kind of read on it? Sort of what is going on with her transforming into Kurt in this scene, or a version of Kurt? Is that sort of her desire, or is that his desire? Is it both?
It's both, for sure. I think the power set here is adding a lot to the symbology. Megan, as we know, is an empathic metamorph, so she changes according to the desires of the people that she's around, and that's problematic from a lot of consent perspectives too, right? Her ability to control those emotions when she finds herself being, reflecting Nightcrawler's lust, let's call it. So I think that's certainly at play. I also think the aftermath of the scene shows that, like, Kurt knows he did wrong. He knows he had a crush on this woman, and he shouldn't have been this kind of playful thing with her. So he has this awareness of his own actions that I think maybe contributes to some of the morality of the scene. But again, there's a romantic component to that as well, in the idea that Kurt is, of course, trying to control himself, but he can't, which is perfect because that's exactly how Megan's powers work. So there's a lot of intersecting symbols at play there that I think takes it into this fantasy realm in a way that a romance comic, without resorting to, elves and fairies and mutants, probably can accomplish.
I mean, I want to read her transforming into him as not just a reflection of him, but a reflection of her desire to not be kind of the perfect person that she has to be for Brian.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that is something I would really like to read into this scene. The way that she appears is a reflection of Brian's appearance and a reflection of her desire to fit in and be beautiful and be a certain kind of woman, right? And we saw in the last issue sort of her reverting to her more monstrous appearance, where she has the hug with Kurt in the rain, right? He has been set up prior to this as something of a symbol for, the difference that she's rejecting. And there's something very potentially powerful to me here in her transforming into him, in terms of that's her grasping that difference, in terms of her grasping not being the perfect woman, and yet still a problem because she's still becoming another man, right?
She's becoming Kurt instead of but maybe that's one of the things that makes it, I'm going to say okay, but I mean that okay in a realistic. When she is upset last issue, when she's upset and turns into her natural wolf girl form, or she starts to, that is her, like, that is her being herself and losing the ability to be Brian's perfect manic pixie dream girl. But I do think she desires Kurt. I agree with you, but she desires Kurt, and she says, well, I don't have to be Brian's dream girl. I can just be Kurt's dream girl instead, which, okay, not exactly agency, but also kind of realistic for, a young girl who's basically meeting the second boy she's ever liked.
Right.
Yeah.
Like she's navigating this stuff.
So I like the point that you brought up, that she's kind of in both situations. Like, I can be this man's version of, like, like the perfect girl, because that's how it's presented in a lot of comics. Like, when you decide to become a version, it's for a man, and I guess this is how it does relate to romance comics in a way. However, I will make a distinction in romance comics. When women what will happen is they'll start presenting themselves for men, and it will often be too sexy, and then another man will come along and be like, oh, that's not really who you are, and then they'll, like, revert to what that man likes, but it will also be realizing that that's what they really are. And I feel like that's not quite as happening here. Like, you get that she is deciding that's also who she is. I don't even think she's, like, and at least what I have seen in my limited view of this character, she hasn't even thought about what she agrees with for herself. And so her agency is up in the air, and I think that's signaled. So it's definitely more progressive than a romance comic in that way, if that makes sense.
Well, let's talk about that, people changing to be more conservative or, like, less sexy. Let's talk about the Kitty and Rachel shopping scene. I mean, I could literally talk about the Kurt and Megan scene all day, but but I want to make sure we touch on that as well, and don't just focus on Kurt Wagner. So what was going, like, you brought up that scene, Sydney, as you felt it was unconventional for a romance comic, which I was interested in. And was it because of the relationship between the characters, or what was it that sort of stood out to you about that scene?
There's a lot of things that's unconventional. I mean, not unconventional. That will be unconventional in romance comics. So first of all, when women shop in romance comics, they are greedy. Like, you're supposed to look good for a man, but if you are taking in consumerism for yourself and not specifically for your home or for a man, and it's just for yourself for enjoying shopping, like, it is bad. Like, you are labeled as horrible. There are a few makeover stories, but once again, you're being made over for a man. So, like, you wouldn't have shopping for any other purposes than looking for like a man or to show that you are a selfish woman. And so there is that. Dude, they're not talking about a man in this, if I remember correctly, they're not talking about a man in this thing. They're just talking about like wearing clothes, and then they're playing with each other, and you see a power dynamic between women that only has to do with them. Like, another man, it doesn't have anything to do with a power dynamic that involves them both liking the same man or anything like that. It's just a relationship that's purely between two women. And so I really love that. I also love that it, like, I feel like the clothing was like, I love how it was set up more like what we would think of as a mall, or you have like the shirts that look the same on the rack. Like, I felt like it was just more realistic. You don't really get that in a romance comic. You only kind of see window shopping and then the before and after of shopping, just in terms of what you would see in a comic. I love that it referenced Marks and Spencer without directly referencing Marks and Spencer, because as someone that lived in England, I was like, I know that store. I shopped at that store, which is just kind of like a weird nerdy moment when you identify with a comic personally, where you're like, I know I love the comic because I somehow see myself in it. Like, just
for sure, but that's like a common Marvel thing, right? Using the real locations, and in this case, it does like try to use real UK locations a lot of the time, because I mean, part of this comic was supposed to appeal to like the British market that had already been familiar with the Captain Britain character, who'd been developed for that market. So yeah, I think it's very on purpose.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't get that really, like, in a romance comic. You wouldn't have gotten, I don't think, like, I also, they could have referenced something from the 1950s and that I wouldn't necessarily have grasped, but you don't get that as much. You don't get as much of a play about like what's happening in the real world. And I just love the power dynamic shift in here, where she changes her outfit into this ridiculous 80s sexy outfit in her.
It's
like,
such a good outfit.
What is happening with that outfit? Like, I kind of want to wear it, and I kind of never want to wear it. Like, it's just like, like, I just love how unapologetically 80s that outfit is. So that was also, but in a romance comic, for looking that daring, she would have been a bad girl. Like, or the person who changed her into that would have been a bad girl. So you don't feel like the appearance of these women in clothing is not as much mirrored to whether or not they're morally good or morally bad. And which is another thing, because appearance in romance comics is always tied to if you're morally good or morally bad. Bad girls are always in red dresses or in sexy outfits. And I feel like because this is about X-Men and this is about superheroes, there's a lot less of that moral coding with the shopping, though you do get a little bit of hinted at. She's like, can you tame yourself? She's like, okay, well, if you're going to make me tame myself, I'm going to put you in this ridiculous outfit. And so it kind of hints that they might be a little bit pushing at boundaries, but none of them are like labeled as horrible. If that did that answer your question? I went on for a little bit. I was just like,
no,
yes,
that was excellent.
Yeah,
no, that's excellent. Yeah, I mean, I really like about that scene, the way it's sort of coming into it from this problematic thing of Brian specifically has suggested that Rachel dress a little bit more conservatively, but Rachel is making a point that, the way I dress is part of my identity. See how it is if I switch up your clothes to reflect a different identity and how uncomfortable you are, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then there's no direct punishment. None of these women are punished like for that. At least in this thing, they're not directly punished for their clothing appearances or their.
Well, yeah, and I mean, these are two teen girls that are just like given free reign to just go out on the town and like do this. So like, yeah, they'd have very little supervision or like anybody directly controlling them, which I think is part of what's fun about this scene.
I think what's fun about it is that Rachel is making exactly Sydney's point here, right? Because so again, Sydney has done an excellent job of sort of grasping years worth of personalities of these characters from 24 pages. But Rachel is coded as a bad girl. That's why Brian has a problem with her, which Sydney hasn't read the previous issue where that's more apparent. But Brian doesn't like how Rachel is because Rachel is an independent young woman. I think she's supposed to be 17, 18. It's hard to say. Comic book age is weird, but she is a teenager, young adult who, this is who I am. It's who I want to be. You're not my daddy. Leave me alone. And Brian is asserting his control here. So this is her rebelling against it. And it's her teaching Kitty that, look, just because you happen to agree with Brian on this issue, this is who I am. So let me be who I am. We've talked about Rachel's clothes a lot, and I think that moment, I mean, it is so very 80s, the outfit, I just love it. but it does
I know, it's
speak
like,
very,
Kitty, you're like 14. Let's make you look like you're 30, because that's
yes,
really what
Uh,
every 14-year-old girl wants.
30 at the club,
yeah.
but
Yes.
she is, but she is, it is Rachel's sort of point of saying, don't try to make me you wouldn't like it if I made you me. And you're right, in this scene at least, she's not judged for I think this is them trying to break at the boundaries of Rachel is suddenly just very comfortable in Excalibur in general. Rachel is very comfortable with, her otherness, her queerness, her individuality on so many levels in a way that Kitty is not and will not be for quite some time.
I was just gonna say, I wanted to say that's a really great point. I wanted to highlight what Anna said about like you're a teenager, we're gonna make you look like you're 30. Like that is something very similar to romance comics, especially in Matt Baker St. John work, where I feel like comic book age isn't known. As Maverick said, like we don't know what's going on. Like I didn't know that until you said these were teenage girls. I didn't know for sure. I kind of assumed they were because that's what happens in comics, where these girls look like they're like I wish I looked like that as a teenager. It would have saved me a lot of
Yeah.
confidence issues. But
Yeah.
but in comic book world, we all get to look awesome. So
Especially when we're drawn by Alan Davis.
Yeah,
yeah.
I would like Alan Davis to draw me in real life, so just if he could just remake me, that would be great.
Yes, I'm sure Kurt was very happy when he got to be drawn by Alan Davis.
Yeah.
But do you have any thoughts about the Kitty Rachel scene, Andrew? I mean, you've done a lot of work on sort of female relationships within the X-Men comics. Like, is this sort of extending from that? Is this something that sort of extends from some of the strategies that we saw Claremont sort of using in Uncanny to complexify the female characters there?
Yeah, I think it's a really nice kind of answer to where Rachel was left off in Uncanny X-Men, where her character arc was largely about being completely insecure and not really having any kind of sense of confidence. So I think what Mav was saying about her just kind of demonstrating that is great. And that's a very traditional way in which you showcase someone resolving an issue where they're now mentoring the next generation. So it's a really nice dynamic with Kitty, but it's a great moment for Rachel as well, just in terms of showing how she's grown as a character in contrast to her earlier iterations.
It's so nice to see them sort of grow in conversation with each other rather than have that, it's not like Kitty being mentored by Wolverine, or like usually you have sort of that older male figure who's like the mentor for the younger girl. You have these two women who have this complicated relationship, and we've talked about the Days of Future Past storyline before, where like in that storyline, Kate Pryde is a mentor to Rachel, and then now we have Rachel becoming a mentor to a younger version of Kitty. So I mean, it's a really fascinating relationship, and it's always so good when they have a moment to shine together, and I really liked this scene.
Yeah, and specifically what Mav was saying again, just about how that's in opposition to Brian, who's a very, I mean, he's trying to be anyway a patriarchal figure here. So having that mentoring exist in defiance of that power.
We've talked about who's the leader of Excalibur, and I was like, should we talk about who's like the dad of Excalibur? I feel like what Brian wants to be, but Kurt is way too irresponsible. So I think that they might be dadless, which is nice.
But and before we run out of time, I mean, I do want to. I would like to touch on Brian a little bit, because we sort of stopped talking about Megan and Kurt's relationship. But I think one of the things that makes us root, not only is Kurt just lovable, just he's fun to read about, and he looks sexy, he's drawn, but Brian, like the narrative very much wants us to hate Brian. Brian is an ass. Like it's not just that he's stiff. Like he's unlikable just in general. He's less unlikable in this issue than he was last issue. But still, even like when you look at Megan's near cheating with Kurt is sort of excused, because a few pages later, 2 pages later, you see Brian just sort of getting more upset that Courtney's been kidnapped than anything that has to do with Megan. And you see Megan like sort of reacting again, as Sydney pointed out, through thought bubbles, but you see Megan reacting towards Brian not really caring about her. And like we know from the previous issues that Megan only exists in the form that she exists because she's trying to be Brian's dream girl. So we forget that maybe she was doing that for Kurt, right? We know from last week that Brian was an ass and just stormed away from Megan, whenever he gets upset. Like he does that sort of thing. So the abusiveness of his relationship with her, I think, sort of tempers powers. Well, all Kurt really did was tickle her. That's not so bad, is it? Like you can sort of do that, which it shouldn't be. You shouldn't excuse one problematic behavior because something else was more problematic. But I think that's sort of what this narrative is sort of doing with us for us.
Yeah, and I think that's part of how it can be problematic, but it's definitely part of how it makes you want to excuse or root for Kurt's behavior, because he's being fun and bringing her into a situation, like spending time with her and making her laugh and making her happy in a way that Brian is not doing.
So, like, I think he's actually Brian is you. I disliked Brian much earlier before Brian even got a chance to act horrible. Like, I'm just gonna back it up. I'm gonna push it a little bit. The moment that it says Kurt, Megan, Rachel are home, and then that look on her face, and she says, "Coming, my love." Like, I was like, Brian is a problem.
Yeah.
I do not like Brian. I do not know what's gonna happen, but he's gonna be a jerk in some way, and I'm just not here for him. I'm here for Nightcrawler. But like, so in that moment, kind of like, I immediately forgot how problematic Nightcrawler. Also, she's speaking with him, and then she gets with Brian's thought bubbles, and he's never once asks her how she's doing, like, so I completely agree with everything that you're saying. I just disliked him much earlier.
I mean, you have to offer a defense of Brian, though. Like one thing that you get in the greater context, particularly from Sword is Drawn, is he is severely traumatized and depressed.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that doesn't excuse his behavior
No.
in any way, but I do think Claremont is packaging that like destructive behavior as part of this profile of, his neglect of Megan.
He is trying to, I think Claremont's trying to build, I mean, we've talked about our theory on Excalibur as a whole is this is 5 people dealing with a collective trauma. We've talked about that from our first episode. And I think Brian is the one who deals with his this collective trauma in the most negative of ways, where, the others are sort of reaching for family. He's the one reaching for the bottle. He's reaching for sex. He's reaching for just self-destructive behavior. Completely believable, not excusable. I don't know that it always plays off as well as, if you need a PhD and 20 years to sit there and dissect it in order to figure that out, that's maybe a problem, right?
Yeah.
And like, and I don't know that you need that, but I do think I think it's an interesting statement towards the, are we looking for something to be unproblematic, or are we looking for it to be realistic? Because certainly there is a point where a certain kind of individual goes through a massive trauma where he loses his twin sister and like resolves it by beating his girlfriend. Yeah, that's a thing that can happen.
I didn't know.
Brian literally died.
I'm a twin. I'm like, oh no, like,
oh god,
Right. That's if you go back to episode 0, we'll talk about that. It is his backstory, and is it problematic? Yes, but is it believable? Absolutely. He watched his sister die on television. That's hard.
That totally makes sense. And as far as reading anything, I'd rather it be realistic than unproblematic, especially if like when you're creating stories, you're not necessarily condoning what's in it when you create it. Also, just from this issue alone, I would like to say that if it was judged like romance comic men, Brian would win. Like, he would be the good guy that we all should have judged. It's like, yeah, he seems kind of boring and stiff and maybe a little harsh, but she was being stupid, and so he would totally win. Nightcrawler would be the bad boy that because if you kiss well, then you're just like a bad guy. So Brian wins in terms of romance comics, just to let you know.
Well, I always figure Kurt must be pretty good at kissing because he's got to navigate those fangs, and that takes practice. But do we want to talk about the cover just quick as kind of our final thing? So this is one of the most iconic Excalibur covers. So it's this cover with the janitor on the black backdrop. Do you want to walk us through this, Andrew? Do you have it in front of you? I almost want to read the text of it, but if you don't have it handy, I've got it handy.
No, I got it. So it's I think it's not the first anticlimactic Excalibur cover. That would be number 3, which has kind of an element.
Number 3 is the one we talked about it last issue. It's the one with Brian knocked into the dirt and stepped over by Juggernaut. Yeah, doing the classic like Allen Iverson over Tyler. Worked in a basketball reference.
So it's just this custodian guy suggesting a pretty insightful, I would say, reading of what's normally in superhero comics, where he says, cover, you mean with huge, muscular, heroic males and beautifully erotic females engaging in gratuitous violence against sinister criminal superbrains and their ugly, stupid henchmen in exotic, moody, high-tech subterranean bases in the eternal struggle to prevent the good being washed away in a tide of chaotic, evil mayhem? Sorry, mate, you'll have to look inside for all that.
So why is this cover so kind of representative of the Excalibur brand? brand, which I think it is in many ways.
Well, anticlimax is sort of the big one, the idea that Excalibur is a book that's not going to take itself too seriously and that is going to undermine the expectations of the superhero genre, well, again, incisively pointing out some of the major problematic tropes of that genre.
I like too that it's, it's subverting but giving it to you at the same time, that it's like making that commentary on how like we're going to deny this on the cover, but actually that is going to be inside the issue, right? Because it's like it's a satire, but it's like this kind of well-meaning satire where it is a traditional superhero comic and yet it's a traditional superhero comic with that kind of postmodern self-reflexive edge to it.
I have a question for Andrew. Just because I was reading it already, right? But you've said this was the first issue you read, right? So if you know nothing,
yeah, did you buy it based on this cover
at 14, and that's the cover? That's the one that hooked you?
Okay, I'm from Thunder Bay, and access to any comics is real sketchy there. And this was like all I could get from Excalibur, and I was like, okay, I'll try it.
Okay.
Oh my god.
Issue 1, but all you got is issue 4, sure.
Okay, good.
So it was just the Thunder Bay factor.
Exactly.
Thunder Bay factor. Oh.
I think we unfortunately have to wrap up because we're like running out of time. But are there other sort of pressing final thoughts that any of you did want to bring up that we didn't get to? Because I always want to give everyone an opportunity to do that.
I just want to say quickly, I hate Arcade so much. He's a Silver Age villain, and I find him incredibly boring.
What? Andrew, you can't bring that up when I'm just saying that we're coming to the end of the episode.
I don't need to defend it. I can just state it and run away.
That's a
thankfully,
huge statement.
Thankfully, we're going to see him again in the next issue. So you'll have a chance to defend that statement, which is incorrect. So we're going to get into it.
I'm going to tune in just to hear you battle it out.
We talked about most of my big issue with this one, not issue, my big point that I would want to talk about in this issue is this is we talked about a little bit. It's very much a male gazy issue that, is aware of what it's doing and trying to comment on it at the same time. From the cover, we didn't really talk about Callisto, but Callisto and Arcade's assistant, everybody is like sort of aware of what they're doing and playing into it. But what's interesting about it is we spent the entire time talking about that, and we talked about the relationships, and we mostly ignored the fight, the actual action of the which the book kind of does. We talked about it with Courtney a little bit, but that's kind of what I think makes this interesting to me, is because this really was a book that's about the relationships. Yeah, there's this whole Murderworld plot. It's called Murderworld, but whatever. Let's talk about shopping.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, yeah, because there was the whole like body swapping thing that happened, which, like, by the way, there's some amazing art there with, as soon as they switch bodies and like gestures in Nightcrawler's body, and he's being very, very flouncy, and like the final panel is just him doing like a ballet leap and saying like ta-ta. It's really excellent.
They'll come up next week, but
yeah, we can talk more about Arcade and more about the body swap.
There's a lot of fight next issue. This issue is not so much about the fight. It's about the relationships.
I know, and as someone who is not well versed in this, I was fine with it, as I said, and I love that you brought me on to talk about it. This was real fun, really, really fun.
Oh, well, it was great for us. I loved having your voice on it. Before we wrap up, though, is there anything that you'd like to plug in terms of your existing work and in terms of where people can find you, if people are interested in hearing more about the kind of stuff that you get up to?
For sure. So, if you want to read a comprehensive overview of romance comics and kind of just like get a taste of what it is I do, I have an article in Panel by Panel. I think it was issue 36, but it's like a whole romance comic special. You can just Google it. A lot of other great stuff on there in romance comics that is not by me as well, so I highly recommend checking it out. And then I have an article in Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics about teenage romance comics and some weird father-daughter relationships that you can also look up. And if you want to hear what I'm up to, I am mostly active on Twitter at Romance Comic BKS, so kind of like a shorthand for romance comic books, and it would be great to have a follow. I tweet about romance comics and all sorts of other interesting things on there, and yeah, that's kind of it for now.
Awesome, thank you so much, Sydney. Yeah, and we'll link your work and obviously your handle when we share the episode.
I was not born to live a man's life, but to be the stuff of future memory. The fellowship was a brief beginning, a fair time that cannot be forgotten. And because it will not be forgotten, that fair time may come again.
Next, in 1 week's time, we will be on to episode 5, in which we will be discussing the continuation of this storyline in Excalibur number 5, Send in the Clowns, featuring more Crazy Gang, more arcade, more Courtney riding a rocket while dressed as Alice in Wonderland into a giant cake, a cameo by Kitty's favorite band, and everybody getting very sticky, you'll see. We've also got another great guest lined up who I know is very eager to chat about this issue, so you have all of that to look forward to. In the meantime, if you liked what you heard, please follow us, like, and review the podcast wherever you're listening to it, or if you want to chat with us about Excalibur or pitch yourself as a guest for a future episode, let us know. You can reach out to us via our website, goshgollywow.com, where we've got some fun extras, and via Twitter at goshgollywow, where we are always posting daily pages from whatever issue we're reading that week, and more fun extras. Thank you, Andrew and Mav, for another awesome conversation. Thank you so much, Sydney, for lending us your insight and expertise. Thank you for listening, and a special thanks to Maximilian of Thoughtform Music for our truly epic theme song. Play us out.